Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the first epistle to the Corinthians in our continuing survey of the New Testament. Let's begin by taking a look at where Corinth was located. It's on the peninsula of what we know today as Greece in the eastern Mediterranean, but let's zoom in on that. Here we have, again, that same Isthmus of Corinth. Notice how the landmass comes together to form a narrow land bridge, and just past that is the site of the ancient city of Corinth. It's on the southern half of what we call Greece, or they refer to that as the Peloponnesian Peninsula. You go there today, there's a channel that has been cut. It was about 100 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. This narrow channel was cut. It allows some small ships to sail through the isthmus. There was an attempt way back in New Testament times to do the same thing. Nero made the attempt to cut a channel here. It was just far beyond the ability of the workers in his day to accomplish that. Here we're standing on the side of Corinth looking at the Temple of Apollo. In the background is what they called the Acrocorinth, and Acropolis was a big city up top on top. So it wasn't a city up there, but there was a temple up top of the Acropolis in the background, on which stood the temple to Aphrodite. And the city was known especially for that particular temple. Of course, Aphrodite was the goddess, of lust and of love, and the city had that kind of reputation. It was known as a party city. There again, the Acrocorinth in the background, but up close we're standing in the marketplace, and if we just were able to turn to the right a little bit, we'd see that Temple of Apollos, which its back door led off into the marketplace, and that's going to cause some issues. Now, Corinth was a smelting pot of many different peoples and cultures. You had Greeks there because it's a Greek city, and yet it was the place of the Roman seat of government for the area. There were pagan cults everywhere you turned. That's again part and parcel with any Greek city, but there was an influx of other people groups there as well as a major metropolis. It was known for its immorality. Because of that temple to Aphrodite, that had given the city a particular reputation. When you talked about Corinthianizing, you were talking about a rather wild, passionate, sexual lifestyle. The church was plagued by division. Now, we're going to see this right in Paul's epistle to the Corinthians, where the big idea he's going to stress is the need for unity to combat the division within the church. Divorce was one of those divisions where there were marriages that were breaking up. There was a trend to glorify the scientific and the philosophical and to ridicule the spiritual. There were questions in the epistle about the role of men and women in the church. There were questions about the use and misuses of the spiritual gifts. One of the gifts that apparently was being misused was the gift of tongues, some certain abilities involving the speaking of other languages. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, Paul says, "Now I exhort you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all agree, and that there be no divisions." Notice right at the outset, he's issuing this problem of divisions, dealing with this. And he insists, he exhorts that there be no divisions among you, but you be made complete in the same mind and in the same judgment. For I've been informed concerning you by my brethren, by Chloe's people. Now, we're not sure who Chloe is, but apparently somebody that was a member of the church, and some folk from her family or relatives or somehow connected to her. From Chloe's people, that there are quarrels among you. There's problems there's fighting going on, bickering going on within the church, and it should not, ought to be. So our first chapter, chapters 1 through 6, deal with this problem of unity. And right in chapter 1, he deals with divisions, and then he moves from there for the need to unity. We get to chapter 5, and he says, now there are some divisions that should have been there. In fact, there's a situation there that's so bad you folks should have dealt with it, where a man was sleeping with his father's wife, presumably his mother-in-law. And there it should have resulted in division. You should have judged that situation and removed him from the church. And for some unknown reason, you haven't done that. And you should have taken action. We get to chapter 6, we find out that some Christians were taking other Christians to court, and he says, no, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be judging it within the church. So there's times when you shouldn't be judging each other, over petty, silly things, and there's times where you should be judging each other, both when there's sin rampant within the church, and also when you have a dispute, bring it to the folks in the church. Let the leaders in the church, exercise judgment over that. So there's a need for unity, but sometimes there's a need for necessary divisions. And that all ought to be taking place in the context of the church. We get to chapter 5, and I just mentioned, there was sexual misconduct that called for church discipline, where the unity of the church was broken by sin. In chapter 6, lawsuits that were they called for church oversight, and the unity was threatened by disagreements within the church. We get to the latter part of chapter 6, and there's lustful temptations that he mentions, that is a call for a connective reminder. We need to be connected to Christ, and we have a unity that we share in Christ, and we need to strengthen one another and encourage one another to live a holy lifestyle. In chapter 7, Paul says, now about the questions that you had, apparently they had written an epistle, and we don't have this epistle. Someone said one time that listening to the epistles, reading the epistles, is like listening to one side of a telephone conversation, and that's the case here. We don't have the questions, but we can puzzle what they are because they are referenced in this side of the telephone conversation. That is, in Paul's epistle, he's writing answers to them, and he says, look, you had questions about being single and versus being married, and so let me explain to that. When it comes to being single is a good thing if you are being single and sexually pure. Now, if you can't do that, then go get married. So being single doesn't have to be permanent, but marriage does. So if you're married, stay married. If you're single and you stay married, that's okay. But if you don't stay married, that's okay too. That's all in chapter 7. We get to chapters 8, 9, and 10, and now we have the issue of meat offered to idols. You see, the Christians in Corinth had some different ideas. When you went into the marketplace, you could buy meat that had been offered to idols, and sometimes you knew it had been offered to idols. Sometimes you weren't sure. Did that mean you shouldn't eat any meat at all that was purchased in the marketplace of Corinth? And in answer to that, there were those who felt that it was wrong to eat, and there were others who felt it was okay to eat such meat. Meat is meat. Didn't really change the quality of meat. Didn't really matter. Whereas there were those who thought, well, gee, that sort of reminds me of worshiping in that pagan temple. I don't want to do that. Don't want to do anything associated with that. And so there was a division in the church. And furthermore, there were those who felt that it was wrong to eat, and they didn't eat, but they were troubled by the fact that there were others in the church that did eat. And then there were those who felt it was wrong to eat, and they ate in spite of thinking it was wrong, and their conscience was troubled, so that they were thinking, well, I'm really engaging in idol worship, but I'm sort of miss my hamburger, so I'm going to do it anyway. And on the other hand, there were those who felt that it was okay to eat, and they were eating without regard to the feelings of others, but Paul suggested them, and here's that fourth category that we see on a chart. He suggested them, in the case where it's going to trouble the conscience of those who think it's wrong, you limit your liberty for concern for the other brothers. And so here's the guideline that he finally gives. He says, look, if somebody brings meat to you, and they tell you, they make a point of it, this meat is offered to idols, then you, even if you think it's okay to eat it, you limit your liberty. You don't eat for the sake of that person whose conscience might be troubled, who might think that you're engaging in idol worship. You limit your God-given liberty because of their situation. Now, if they just bring you a hamburger and they don't make any mention of offer to idols or anything, then don't worry about it. Don't sweat it. If you feel it's okay and that's not your issue, don't make it the issue. Don't bring it up. Just have a good hamburger. Enjoy it. So in chapter 8, verse 1, there's a call to limit the liberty for the sake of the weaker brother. In chapter 9, Paul gives the example of this kind of limited liberty in his own situation, where Paul points out the limitation of his liberty. Now, Paul had the right because he had ministered in Corinth. He had started the church. He had become, I guess today we would call that the senior pastor, although I'm not sure they used those kind of terms back then. Paul had the right to be paid as the organizing, leading leader in that church. He had a right to expect that the church would meet his financial needs. Not that he would be going around driving a Cadillac or the chariot version of that, but that his basic necessities would be met. And Paul had limited his liberty. He had not taken a salary from the church. Instead, he had worked with his own hands, and at times he had accepted donations from other churches that were supporting him, so that he would not be a financial burden upon the Corinthians. And so he had limited his liberty in doing that. He had the right to be paid in ministry, that's chapter 9, verse 1, and all those verses, but he had limited his liberty for the sake of the Corinthians. And so he gives himself as the example, and he says, now you can follow that same example, not in that same way, but in a different way, in the eating of meat and in the not eating of meat. And you can see where the principle could apply to other situations as well. He gets to chapter 9, verse 24, and he says, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? So you run in such a way that you may win. And everyone who competes in the games, now Corinth was actually known for having a series of games. You've heard of probably the Olympics, but that was way over on the west side of the Greek peninsula. Over here on the east side, the common games were known as the Isthmus Games. They were held right here in Corinth. Verse 25, and he says, and everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. And they do that in order to receive a perishable wreath. You wouldn't get a gold medal. You would get a wreath that would be put on your head, and that meant that you won the race, and that was a great thing. And they were striving, they were exercising, they were preparing to win that wreath. And after a while, that wreath would get old, and you'd hold on to it until it fell apart, and then you'd toss it out. We labor, we practice, we exercise self-control for a reward that is much greater because it is much longer lasting. It is an imperishable wreath. Therefore, Paul says, I run in such a way, not without aim, not without plan. He's planning what he's doing. I box in such a way, not that he's literally hitting somebody, this is figurative. I box in such a way, not as beating the air, but I buffet my body and make it my slave, lest possibly after I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. And he goes from there to talk about the illustration, this is going to take us into chapter 10, of disqualification. Let's look at that. That idea of being disqualified. For I do not want you to be unaware, this is chapter 10, verse 1, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud. This is talking about Israel coming out of Egypt and after the Exodus. Our fathers were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, all ate the same spiritual drink. You notice all the alls? They were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized in Moses and in the cloud and in the sea, all ate the same spiritual drink, all drank the same spiritual or food and drink. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. He's telling the story of what took place in the book of Numbers in the wilderness after they'd come out of Egypt. All those people came out of Egypt, but they all died in the wilderness. They didn't make it into the promised land. Why? Because God was not well pleased. They didn't follow the rules. They didn't do that which they did do that which disqualified them. Now, chapter 10, verse 11. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. That's, it wasn't written just so that they would know that. They knew that. It was written so that we would read it and would be changed by it. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Because no temptation has overtaken you but such as is common to man. You're being tempted to do some things, and sometimes you're even being tempted to do things that by themselves aren't necessarily wrong, but they are not the best. And no temptation has overtaken you but such as is common to man. Here's the good news: God is faithful. The bad news is that temptation is commonplace. Everybody gets tempted. The good news is God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but will, with the temptation, will provide the way of escape also, that you may be able to bear it. Anytime you face a temptation, there is built into that temptation, according to this passage, a way of escape. God has provided for you. Now, we get to chapters 11 through 16. And now Paul is going to speak about errors in the church. One of those errors involves women and worship, and there was a practice of going away from the tradition that called for women to wear head coverings and that which would show their proper place within the church. And Paul corrects that. And then he moves on to the Lord's Supper, where there was a practice. Notice each of these relate back to the issue of unity and divisions in the church. There was a practice where some who had lots of money would have a steak dinner at the Lord's Supper, and somebody else sitting next to them might be going hungry. A lack of unity within the church. And he says, no, don't do that. You got go have your dinner at home. When you have the Lord's Supper and show your unity in that. And then there were problems, as we already noted, with various gifts in the church, especially the one that's singled out is the gift of tongues. Apparently there were problems with that. I guess maybe there's still problems with it today, of people misusing that and it being an issue that divided the church instead of something that helped to edify, build up, and unite the church. And that ought to be. Paul actually says, look, it's better just to limit the use of that gift. Not that it was a bad gift, but better to limit it rather than hurt the church and divide the church. And then he comes to the final area, and this area is in the area of the resurrection. All the others are practice. This is an area of doctrine, because there were some people who were saying, do people really rise from the dead? I mean, what's that doctrine? And Paul says, that's so important because our whole faith is based on the fact that we believe somebody rose from the dead. His name was Jesus, and he was seen by witnesses. He really died. He really was buried. He really rose from the dead. And because of that, you're going to rise too one of these days. And so he spends that entire chapter 15, dealing with the issue of the resurrection.